In the autumn of 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman walked into his commanding general's headquarters with a plan so reckless that it would take weeks of argument just to get it approved, and that even then would leave the President of the United States quietly terrified. Sherman wanted to take 60,000 men, cut himself off completely from his own supply lines, abandon his railroad, his telegraph, his line of retreat, every single thread that connected his army to safety, and march that army straight into the heart of enemy territory, living off whatever it could tear out of the land as it went. He would have no base, no resupply, no road home, and no way at all to call for help if it went wrong. Every military textbook of the age said exactly the same thing about an army that did what Sherman was proposing. It died. An army cut off from its base, buried deep in hostile country, surrounded by enemies and unable to feed itself, was not a bold army. It was a doomed one. That was not some fringe opinion. It was the settled doctrine of war, and measured against it, Sherman's plan was not daring. It was suicide. Abraham Lincoln himself later admitted that he had watched the thing begin feeling anxious, if not afraid. And the strange, riveting truth of the March to the Sea is that almost everyone who called it madness had excellent reasons to, and almost every one of them turned out to be wrong. This is the story of the greatest gamble of the entire Civil War, and of the month of total silence that very nearly broke the nerve of the men who had bet everything on it. By the time Sherman conceived this plan, he had already taken Atlanta, the great industrial hub of the Confederacy in the West, and he had burned its capacity to make war to the ground before he was finished with it. But capturing Atlanta had left him holding a problem that any general of his day would have recognized at once. He was now sitting deep inside enemy territory at the far end of a single, fragile railroad that ran more than 100 miles back to his supply depots in the north. That railroad was his lifeline, and it was also his cage. Guarding every mile of it against Confederate raiders tied down enormous numbers of his men, and as long as he stayed chained to it, he could not move freely or strike at anything that truly mattered. Most generals facing that problem would have looked for a better way to protect the lifeline. Sherman proposed to cut it himself, on purpose. His idea was to sever his own connection to the north completely, turn his back on his base of supply, and march southeast across the whole state of Georgia toward the port city of Savannah and the sea, nearly 300 miles away. His 60,000 men would carry what they could and take the rest from the farms, plantations, and storehouses of Georgia as they passed, a practice the army politely called foraging, and which the people on the receiving end of it would call something a great deal harsher. To understand why this terrified the men above him, you have to understand what cutting loose from a supply base actually meant to a soldier of that era. It was very nearly unthinkable. An army was a living thing that had to be fed every single day, and the entire science of war was built around protecting the long, vulnerable arteries that kept it fed. To voluntarily sever your own artery in the middle of enemy country with no plan to reconnect it for weeks on end broke the most basic rule in the entire book. If the march slowed, if the enemy concentrated against it, if the food simply ran out, there would be no rescue and no retreat. 60,000 men would just be gone. And before we follow them into Georgia, let me be blunt about why this channel exists, because this is precisely the kind of story it was built for. The version of the March to the Sea that most people are handed is a single flat sentence: Sherman burned Georgia, end of story, with all of the daring and all of the terror carefully stripped out of it. The real thing was one of the boldest and most dangerous bets any commander in history has ever placed, and almost no one ever tells it that way. If that is the history you came here for, the version with the stakes left in, then stop and subscribe right now, because this is the only thing this channel does. Now, back to the danger that made the whole plan look insane. Because there was a second reason the plan looked like madness, and this one had nothing to do with doctrine at all. It was a flesh and blood army, and it was loose. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, under the aggressive and unpredictable John Bell Hood, was still very much in the field, and rather than sitting quietly to be dealt with, Hood had done something Sherman had not counted on. He had marched his army north, away from Atlanta, back up toward Tennessee, threatening the supply lines and the cities behind Sherman's back. Think for a moment about what that meant. The textbook response, the obvious response, was for Sherman to wheel around and chase Hood to protect his own rear and destroy the enemy army now loose behind him. Instead, Sherman proposed to do the precise opposite. He would let Hood go. He would turn his back on an intact enemy army marching in one direction and march his own men hard in the other. To the cautious minds back in Washington, this did not look like strategy. It looked like a man ignoring a fire in his own house so that he could go for a long walk. Sherman's answer to the Hood problem was as cold and clear as everything else about his plan. He would split his forces. He would send a strong, capable army back under one of his most trusted and methodical subordinates, a Virginian named George Thomas, to track Hood down and finish him, while Sherman himself took the rest and vanished into Georgia. It was a calculated division of risk, and it leaned entirely on Thomas being able to handle Hood alone. If Thomas failed, if Hood broke through and ran wild in the Union rear while Sherman was out of contact and impossible to reach, the disaster would simply double. 2 armies lost instead of 1. Sherman was wagering not only his own march, but the safety of everything behind him on his reading of 2 men and 1 theory. And then he stopped explaining himself, and he started walking. That theory is the thing that separates Sherman from nearly every general who came before him, and it is worth slowing down on because it is the actual point of the entire march. Sherman had come to believe something that sounds almost obvious now, but was close to radical then. He believed that winning battles was not enough to win the war. You could beat the Confederate armies in the field over and over again, and as long as the South still possessed the will to fight, and the farms and factories and railroads to supply that fight, the war would simply grind on without end. The thing that truly had to be broken was not just the enemy's army, it was the enemy's capacity and its will to go on fighting at all. So the march was never really aimed at Confederate soldiers. It was aimed at the war machine standing behind them and at the morale that fed it. As his men moved across Georgia, they tore up the railroads that carried Confederate supplies, heating the rails over fires and twisting them so they could never be used again. They burned the depots, the mills, the storehouses, the baled cotton, the whole infrastructure of a war economy. They stripped the countryside of the food that fed the armies. Sherman captured the entire philosophy in a single, now famous phrase when he said that he could make Georgia howl. There was a hard strategic edge running underneath the phrase as well. Georgia sat squarely in the middle of what remained of the Confederacy, and a Union army marching clean across it would split the South physically in half, severing the western states from the eastern ones and cutting the rail lines that carried men, food, and munitions between them. If Sherman could carve that path and reach the coast, he would not only have proven his theory about will and morale, he would have driven a wedge straight through the body of the Confederacy that it had no way to pull back out. The march, in other words, was an argument and a maneuver at the very same time, a demonstration of a new kind of warfare wrapped around a very old and very practical goal, which was to cut the enemy cleanly in 2. It is important to be precise right here, because this is the part of the story that gets twisted in both directions. The destruction was real, and it fell on civilians as well as on soldiers, and it was done deliberately as a matter of cold strategy. Sherman did not stumble into it by accident. It was the plan. Whether that kind of war, a war waged against a whole population's ability to endure, was a legitimate act of strategy or a terrible crime, is a question people have argued over ever since, and it is not one this story is going to settle for you. What matters for understanding the gamble is only this. Sherman believed that breaking Georgia's will to fight was worth the staggering risk of the march, and the only way on earth to find out whether he was right was to disappear into it and see, and disappearing is exactly what he did. On the 15th of November, 1864, Sherman's army marched out of the ruins of Atlanta, and as it went, Sherman cut the last telegraph wire connecting him to the north. It was entirely deliberate. He did not want the enemy reading his intentions, and he did not want Washington able to second-guess his every move in real time. But the effect of that one act was something close to unbearable for the men who had approved the gamble. For weeks on end, the entire Union High Command, the president very much included, had no reliable idea where Sherman was, whether his army was winning or losing, or whether it still existed at all. Picture that silence from inside Washington. 60,000 men, one of the principal armies of the United States, had walked straight off the edge of the known map into the heart of the Confederacy and then simply gone quiet. No reports, no dispatches, no way to send an order or to receive an answer. Lincoln, who had staked enormous political capital on the war and on Grant's judgment in letting the march proceed, could do nothing at all but wait. Grant could do nothing but wait. The only news that trickled out came from Southern newspapers, and that news was naturally full of confident claims that Sherman was trapped, that his men were starving, that they were being harried and cut to pieces, that the mad Yankee gamble was collapsing exactly the way everyone had warned it would, and there was no way on earth to know how much of any of it was true. What made the silence even crueler was that there was just enough truth woven into the rumors to keep the fear alive. Sherman's march was not entirely unopposed. Confederate cavalry harried the edges of his columns. Hastily gathered state militia turned out to slow him. Bridges were burned ahead of him and swollen rivers blocked his path. And any one of those frictions, magnified by distance and by imagination, could be spun in a Richmond newspaper into the opening act of a catastrophe. The men in Washington were not fools, and they knew the South had every reason in the world to exaggerate. But they also knew that an army cut off and surrounded genuinely could be destroyed, and that if it were, this was exactly how they would first learn of it, in the enemy's own triumphant headlines. So they read the Southern papers and tried to sift the real danger from the propaganda, and found that they simply could not, because they had no thread of their own left to pull on. They were reduced, the most powerful men in the Union, to guessing. For a solid month, that silence held, and it pressed down on the men in Washington like a physical weight. Every single day that passed without word could mean the army was marching steadily and safely toward the sea, or it could just as easily mean it had already been destroyed and no one had survived to send the news. This is the part of the story the postcard version always leaves out, the part that turns the march to the sea from a simple tale of destruction into a story of almost intolerable suspense. The whole enormous bet, the careers, the strategy, and the lives of 60,000 men sat in total darkness for weeks, and not one of the men who had wagered on it could do a single thing but hope. And then, just before Christmas, the silence finally broke. Sherman's army came out of Georgia in front of the port city of Savannah, having marched nearly 300 miles through the very heart of the Confederacy, almost without serious opposition. The Confederate defenders of the city, badly outnumbered, slipped away into the night rather than be trapped inside it, and on the 21st of December, Savannah fell into Sherman's hands intact. The army that Washington had quietly mourned for dead was not only alive, it had cut the Confederacy in two, wrecked the war economy of an entire state, and arrived at the sea stronger and more confident than when it had set out. Sherman sat down and sent a telegram north, and the message he chose has become one of the most famous lines of the entire war. He offered the captured city to the president as a Christmas gift, presenting Lincoln with the city of Savannah, its heavy guns, its ammunition, and its thousands of bales of cotton. The relief in Washington was beyond description. The gamble that even Lincoln had feared was outright suicide had instead become one of the most decisive strokes of the whole war, a blow that shattered Southern morale and made it brutally plain to everyone watching that the Confederacy could no longer protect even its own heartland. So where, in the end, does the line fall between madness and genius? By every rule of war that Sherman's own contemporaries had been carefully taught, the march to the sea should have ended in catastrophe. The fact that it did not was not luck. It was the result of a general who had grasped something about the nature of that particular war that the men above him, for all of their caution and all of their hard-won good sense, did not yet understand. Sherman saw that the true weakness of the South was not its armies but its will, and he was willing to risk absolutely everything, including 60,000 men and his own place in history, on being right about it. But the march was only one half of the bet that Sherman placed that autumn. While he was vanishing into Georgia in triumph, the army he had so deliberately turned his back on, Hood's Army of Tennessee, was marching hard in the opposite direction, toward that methodical Virginian general waiting for it in the cold outside of Tennessee City, and toward a fate even more complete and more final than the one Sherman had just escaped. And what happened to the enemy that Sherman chose to ignore is a story entirely its own.